Hi, I'm Eshaan, Vice President of the iWRITE Youth Club and Chief Editor of the iWriter magazine. And today I am super excited to be speaking to Miss Amy Shira Teitel, an incredible author, spaceflight historian, public speaker, YouTuber, blogger, and podcaster. Amy has also written for Scientific American, Nerdist, and Time magazine. Her YouTube channel, The Vintage Space, has more than 360,000 subscribers. And her book, Fighting for Space, is releasing very soon, perfectly timed for the Perseverance mission to Mars and for Women's History Month. Teitel's second book centers around female pilots Jackie Cochran and Jerry Cobb. The book delves into the intricate details of their lives and their accomplishments, showing their incredible willpower and strength and how they fought the inherent gender bias in mid-20th century American society. It's an incredible piece, and I am looking forward to speaking with Amy about it, about her writing process, her career as a space historian, the importance of empowering women, and so much more. This is going to be a really fun one. This is really interesting for me because I've actually never met a space historian. That seems like such a cool profession because I'm into science and history. So that's a nice, meeting point of both of them.
Yeah.
So tell me more about your career in being a space historian and like what maybe drew you to it.
Yeah, I love that you say you don't often get to meet a space historian because there aren't many of us. Because like my job isn't really a job that exists so much as something that I really like. So I just made into a job. Basically, I mean, like you, I've always been fascinated with spaceflight and the intersection of space and history because I love history. And I didn't really know what to do with that. So like I studied history of science in undergrad, and I have a master's in science technology studies, but it was always like not quite what I wanted it to be. Because what I love doing is researching this stuff and then sharing it with people because it's so cool. And if you can just like break down the wall of, scary engineering or scary science, everyone understands it. And it's so fun to like get people excited about science and history. So that's kind of how I ended up just like doing popular science writing and doing the YouTube thing and just like having a way to try to translate like this very cool science that people think is really intimidating, but is actually just like, you can do it in English and it's very accessible.
That's awesome. Yeah. And so going from being a space historian to also being an author, how does that tie in? And how did you maybe get into writing?
I've always wanted to write. I was a reader. I was always a reader. Like when I was a kid, my parents would like, if you did well at a gymnastics meet, here's a book. Like it was always like the book was always the carrot, as it were. I always loved reading, so I always wanted to write. And I did very little studying of writing, but I think how it kind of like relates to my history stuff is like I said, this kind of love of explaining it to people and communicating it and getting it out to people. It's so fun. And a book is like doing that, but in much larger scale. Because, instead of taking like one thing, like here's a cool fact about the moon landing to here's a story that you've never heard. And I'm going to tease it out in all of its glory. It's kind of a really natural progression. It's really like a natural outlet for me to just take what I love and let it breathe as much as it needs to breathe to tell the full story.
That sounds amazing. Yeah. And I mean, I'm a fan of historical fiction and historical nonfiction. And so that sort of divide between those two. So, I mean, with you being a space historian, I'm sure you've also been exposed to both types of writing. So what caused you to represent your stories as nonfiction?
Nonfiction for me, I always say that for me it's easier because like your punchline. Fiction has always been, honestly, as a writer, fiction is super daunting because you don't know where it's going and you need to figure it out, and that's really hard. But with history, it's like where it ends, and then the challenge is piecing it together and finding all of the research to make that story really come to life the way you want it to. So, part of it is that I like piecing together historical events and finding those elements that you don't know are a part of it. It's like, I would say it's like archaeology, but with words almost. But the other thing too, I think, especially when we're talking about like space flight, science fiction and like or fictional spaceflight is always so much less fun than real space for me. Like, I don't feel like you need to add drama of like, crews fighting or whatever. Like, it's exciting enough as it is. And the real story, I think, is because it's real, is actually so much more exciting. I prefer it. I just would rather dig into the real story and like show people like, yeah, you don't need to go into the realm of fiction to find like the cool science, the stuff that's really inspiring. It's in your world. It's right there. So that's kind of the main reason that I like to really explore and get deep into history and the
That sounds
nonfiction.
awesome. Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. I mean, even as a student for me, like reading both types, I see so many differences, but there's also some similarities. And I do think that even though like nonfiction seems so much more serious, there are things that are more fun and like I feel more realistic in historical nonfiction, of course, but realistic, of course, but in historical nonfiction than in historical fiction.
Yeah. And I think it all comes down to the way you write it too. Like, you can choose to write history and you can choose to write your nonfiction as like a very academic, like, and then this person did this and they would go on to do this. Like, you can, I don't know why that's the voice, but you know what I mean? Or you can write it in a way that like creates an immersive experience. You can write it that in a way that like it feels as fun and engaging as fiction. And I think as a writer, that's where like the fun challenge is. Like, I wanted to write with Fighting for Space, I wanted to write a book that people would read it and be like, is this real? I'd be like, it is. Check it out. It's fun. History is fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what drew you to the stories of Jerry Cobb and Jackie Cochran? Like, I'm sure you would have known about them before, but maybe what kind of motivated you or what pulled you to their stories and why did you represent them in writing?
Yeah, their stories, I got interested in it. The story of the quote unquote Mercury 13 comes up a lot. It's this idea, or the story basically of a group of 13 women who are qualified for spaceflight, but who are kept out of the agency because they're women in the 60s. And it's, and I started researching that story once, like years ago, and I was like, that's not all that's happening, because there's a whole lot that's happening is like with the space agency and with the Cold War, and like you can't take the story of these women and just like remove it from historical context and make it something that it's not. So when I started researching to maybe write a book about it, it was really like Jerry's story, because she's kind of central to the astronaut issue, and putting her within the NASA context. But then I started looking into Jackie, who's like typically the villain, because she testifies against women in space at this congressional subcommittee hearing. And I was like, okay, why is the villain this like record-setting, amazing woman that no one's like, I had come across her name, but I knew nothing about her. I started researching her and I was like, okay, so she's the coolest person that no one knows exists. And then it was like the only way, and then I realized that like everyone in Jerry's story with respect to this astronaut issue is in Jackie's world. So like the whole thing is actually Jackie's story. Jerry is just one of the key players in it in a way. So then it was like, well, the obvious way to do this is this dual biography approach to give you both stories and tell you about both women in a way that kind of comes together over the key issue of the astronauts. So that's it very much evolved. Like it very much evolved over the course of writing the proposal.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm sure it was a real journey, I'm sure, from the beginning to the end. So yeah. What was the hardest part of writing Fighting for Space? Was it like representing the stories of the women in history, or what do you think?
I think the hardest thing with this book was trying to get everything straight, because, and I mentioned this in the author's note at the end, that both of our main women wrote memoirs and did interviews, but like they are humans and they embellished stories and they lied. Jackie especially like hid her whole past. She never acknowledged her family.
Yeah, that was interesting.
So right? I had so much fun tracking down like her old marriage records and stuff from the 20s. So getting these like little bits and pieces and trying to make it fit into like the real story, and things that I kind of knew existed but couldn't find a lot of evidence of, like Jerry's whole like romance with her boss at one point when she's in her early 20s with this guy Jack Ford. She conveniently just never mentions that he was married and that his wife was also one of her bosses. And that's just like skipped over in her memoir, because when she wrote it, he had already died in an airplane crash. So it's just like, okay, so you can like hint at these things. So trying to keep it exciting, trying to keep it immersive for the reader. keeping all of these elements as straight as possible while still not saying that I said that this person did this. I had to work really hard to make sure that the action of all of the women was on them, so that if someone else said, well, I read that she did this, I'm like, I didn't say that she did it. I actually wrote it in a way that she felt this, because that's what she did feel. She may have been wrong. So it was really this interesting way of like, because it's one of my pet peeves if you're writing history, don't be like, Jerry's thought this, but in reality, this was happening. Like, don't break. It's like breaking the fourth wall, like, don't do that. So it was a challenge. It's a very fun challenge to kind of like make it very clear that the women and everyone was speaking for themselves. And I was not attributing that to them. I was just giving them a voice.
Right. And so, yeah, the historical nonfiction, especially like fact checking, as you were saying, kind of being very careful about how you word things, also making sure everything is accurate. That's pretty crucial, I think, in the journey of writing in writing nonfiction. So without like, of course, you said you could go the academic route or also go like the slightly more creative route. So without like footnotes or like parenthetical citations or anything like that, how did you conduct fact checking?
Yeah, well, my version has footnotes.
Oh, okay.
My version of the manuscript is footnoted. I think I have almost 1,300 footnotes.
Oh, wow.
So it's big. And we made the decision, my editor and I actually made the decision to take out footnotes in the published version, because she emailed me one day. She's like, this is out of hand. We're going to add like 60 or 80 pages to this book because of your footnotes. And I was like, okay, so what's our happy medium? So we ended up with a note section that just has like per chapter, all of the sources in order, so that like, it means so much of it is like, when, Jerry wrote a letter to Jackie, like you can find it pretty easily in the notes, like where it is, where it came from. And because it's National Archives, exactly what box in what library it's in. But it's really like for me, my versions are footnoted like mad. I've got notes to like keep things straight and triangulate, like here's, cross-reference with this one. And like, it's all there. We just took it out because I'm not writing for an academic audience. I didn't want to have, personally, I don't know about you, but if I'm reading a book that has the little numbers up top, it's distracting.
Yeah.
Unless I need the information, like adjusting dollar amounts to modern day so that you understand what 10 cents in 1912 is or something. The average person doesn't need to know where this letter lives. It's fine to have it in the notes if you really want to dig. But my own version, I have my final PDF copy of it is very footnoted, because it means that if anybody asks me a question, I can just search in my doc and exactly find what I'm looking for.
Right. Yeah. And so these 1,300 footnotes, I'm sure you have like tons and tons of sources. So like, as far as the drafting process goes, how did you conduct and organize all that research?
Poorly. No. I feel like the interesting thing with research is that everyone has such a unique way that their brain collates information. I'm one of those people that has to handwrite, because there is research that says when you handwrite, it creates a link between your hand and your brain to remember something. So I handwrite all of my notes, which is insane. So basically what I did is I have a deep system of Post-its, and I also use book darts. I don't know if you've ever used these, but book darts. They are these tiny little metal things. I am not sponsored by them, but I love it. They slide over the page. They do not mark your page, and you can I would book dart something to oblivion, write out all the notes, and then keep the necessary ones in, and then do it again for the next book, and then the next book, and then the next book. But then I also went to National Archives and I took photographs of every page that I wanted, and I came back with more than 6,000 pages from the Eisenhower Library alone. And I had all of that printed with FedEx, because I have to have a tangible thing. And then I organized all of the letters, all of the papers into groups by topic, and then chronologically by date. And I filed all that away. And as I was doing that, I put Post-its sticking up so that I could see in my little research box, here's the letter, the March 8th letter, Jerry to Jackie, the March 15th reply, Jackie to Jerry. So I could easily find these things. But it just like, I created my own system that I painstakingly built, so that when I was looking through, I'm like, where's that March 62 letter I want? I knew where to find it in my box. Boxes, I should say. There's 7 of them, I think.
Oh, wow.
It's a lot. Those like big file boxes you get at Target. So yeah, it was really just a matter of like taking everything that I could get my hands on, reading through as much as I could, taking all the notes, and then reorganizing it so that by the time I was done reorganizing it, I knew what I had, and as I was writing it too, as I was organizing it rather, if I found a good letter, I typed it up. I just typed up the whole thing, so that was like in the manuscript roughly where I wanted it, so that when I was then smoothing it out and working it in, I could just like, highlight the 3 sentences of a letter that stayed in. At least it was there, and I knew where it was. So my first draft, it's up there. I'm looking at it. It was my first draft was probably about 600 pages or something, because I had these full like 4-page letters typed up just so that I would know while I was going through, I wouldn't have to go somewhere else. It was all in one document together. It was a mess, but it worked. Everyone finds their own way of researching. And I find it very interesting to see how other people deal with that process.
I'm sure, yeah. And so from that 600-page draft, like how is the winnowing down? Like what would be your tips for like kind of taking all that info and condensing it?
Yeah, it's definitely it's a challenge, and I feel like the best tips I have when you're kind of winnowing that stuff down, if you have a structure in mind of like with a book, like writing, that you want chapters to do this, allow yourself flexibility to shift things around, because as you go and you see your idea developing, let it become what it needs to become. But the other thing that I try to do, and I feel like just because I've read other stuff, I feel like is a piece of advice some people might need, is if it's not vital to your story, but you feel like it's interesting, go with what's vital, not with what you think is interesting. Like sometimes you have this little side note and it might be neat, but all it does in the end is serve to like show that you researched a thing. It doesn't add to the story. So try to be, what I ended up doing was cutting out a lot of stuff and making them standalone articles and blog posts and videos so that I could still use the research. But if it was taking away from the main story, the main narrative, just prune. Just don't get bogged down in the details. Let your keep focus on that, and know that you can always add the research later. You still have it, but be pretty ruthless. So yeah, it's tough. It is really, really tough. And like when you love something so much, to let sections of it go, but sometimes you gotta.
Yeah, and looking at that EARC that I received, I'm sure you condensed it from 600 to what? I think 450, 400?
432 pages.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so it's still long.
But it went from this to probably this.
Yeah,
which is a big deal.
Yeah. It got shorter. Lots of stuff didn't make it in the final, and a lot of stuff too was like, if I loved this whole conversation, this whole letter was really great, but the other thing to pay attention to is pacing. Like if you're reading it back and it's just like, this slows down, like, all right, we're going to have to get this whole 3 paragraphs into like one condensed thing to get the core idea across, and just like hit you with it and move on, so that we maintain that pacing. That's a big thing too.
Right. Yeah. Pacing for sure.
Yeah. So
zooming out of this entire thing. So looking back at the writing process, what's been the most gratifying moment for you?
So many. There's nothing better. Like I'm an archive nerd, so there's nothing better than when you're researching a bunch of stuff and you find like that letter that pulls things together, and all of a sudden you see like multiple disparate pieces. You're like, oh, okay. It's like the non-crazy version of like tying things together with yarn, and then they all come to your central point and you're like, I know who did it. Finding those little moments that align, that give you your like really just reinforce your narrative. Finding the correspondence that just like fills a gap that you were looking for. Like you find that one letter and you're like, this changes everything in the best way. And getting creative with that, like that's the best part. And I got really lucky in this case that there's a ton of documentation that exists about this issue, mainly that Jackie kept every letter she ever wrote or received. And there were tons of things. Like I stumbled upon something in her husband's files that mentioned Jerry lying about something. And this was written in the 70s. This is like after the story, the time frame of this book. And I found it and I was like, oh, I think this might be the epilogue. I think this might be the thing that kind of ties it together. And it was, letting it breathe, and then finding that one thing that was like, okay, yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think that's also, it's nice. It's like, when you get a clean board in Tetris, those types of things.
Yes.
Like, yes.
Yes. It's when you've left that, like that narrow space on the side, you're like waiting for it, and you just get the piece and you're like, it fits. Exactly right.
So what do you hope that kid readers will take away from Fighting for Space?
Many things. I don't know. It's for kind of for the younger reader. I think there's a few things, but I think the main thing, even though this is a book about two women, I didn't try to make it about women necessarily so much as like, guess what, women are just human. And I think it's important for young female readers and girls to read and just take inspiration from like how much these women went through, but also for boys to read and be like, yeah, these people are amazing as people. Cause like, I think there's just a lot of that. I feel like it's changing. Generationally it's changing, but like I want young readers to just look at all of the women in this book as just people who did amazing stuff, and neither of them are perfect. They both did awful stuff. They were not great necessarily, because they're human and humans are flawed, but they both have elements that are so inspirational that no matter who you are, even if you're not a pilot or, pursuing this, that you can just find inspiration from the way, Jackie refused to allow people to scare her out of flying a bomber, or Jerry refused to take no for an answer and fought. Like, this is a lesson that is just like, you can take into yourself no matter who you are. And I kind of like, my hope, and I always say it's like my rainbows and unicorns view of the future, but like, I would just I'm so excited to see the next generation like coming up, just being very like, we are people and we can do things, and we are taking all of the inspiration on board. And like, yeah, I think that would be kind of my main thing for younger readers, is to just find your moment of inspiration and take that into yourself.
That's amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for speaking with me, Amy. It was wonderful to hear your perspectives, and I know for me, actually, one of the best parts was hearing about how you organize your research, and also how you winnowed down that massive book, the 600-page book, into a 400-page book, which is winnowing it down quite a bit. And since I'm a wordy writer, that's perfect for me. It's amazing advice. Thank you so much, and have an amazing day. Bye!